Hello, friends. Welcome to Liturgical Shenanigans, a Wayfolk Arts podcast, where we invite you to explore liturgy, faith, the arts, and everything in between with us, your hosts, Phil, Jackson, Maddie, and Hannah. That's me. In this 5th episode, we hear and discuss a lament written by Maddie. If you would like to follow along with the lament, you'll find a link in the description. As you prepare to listen, we'd like to offer you a content warning. Maddie's piece is a lament for women abused by clergy. So in this episode, there will be mention of clergy abuse and church abuse. We are eager to share this liturgy with you. Let's join the conversation.
Hello, friends.
Hey.
If you are still learning our voices, this is Maddie, and Maddie, got to be part of a really cool project this past summer, or I got invited this past summer to be part of an ongoing project. It's a book of liturgies called A Liturgy for All Bodies, and I don't like anything I just said.
Fair enough.
Here's a fun fact about me. I don't like marketing for myself. So we're going to get through this, and I'm going to remind myself that this isn't just about me. It's about multiple bodies from a liturgy for all bodies. But it's a really cool upcoming resource that's going to be made available to you, not just you as listeners, but just to the world at large. So I'm actually going to read you a little bit about the project directly from the website, but in our show notes, we will be sure to link the website page for the liturgy book where you can purchase it for pre-sale. Due to large amounts of publishing delays, such is the world these days, the physical book will not be available until May. However, there is going to be an online database available to individuals starting in January. And it will just, I think, be an exciting time to keep up with what this project is continuing to go ahead and try to do despite the publishing delays. Also, the book that is coming out in hard copy eventually is just beautiful. It is a work of art in and of itself. So I hope you'll check out their website. But the goal of the resource was specifically for communities that want to engage the Bible or the teachings of Jesus in general, but have turned away from the visions of God that maintain the status quo. So it's a liturgy by the woman at the well, the man in need of healing, the bug-eating prophet in the wilderness, the exiled person with a stutter, and the refugee child sharing wisdom with the temple leaders. It's in search of truth written by any bodies with a story to tell. It assumes that people who are poor are viable leaders, that people with disabilities have insights, that voices who have experienced cultural and ancestral trauma are ripe with knowledge of God's healing work. And then this specific part is what really drew me into the project. So the writers in this collection are ordained Christian ministers, others are mystics, they're lay people, poets and teachers, poor, queer, disabled, neurodivergent, Black, Indigenous, people of color, using all different translations of biblical text to illuminate old stories with living bodies. So I think it does a really good job of being work written by the people for the people in ways that perhaps are not, both are traditional and are not traditional. So it kind of lets you lean into storytelling in a new way. So I was really honored to be asked to even get to contribute pieces for this project, and the liturgy that we're going to engage on our podcast today is something that I specifically wrote for this project. So if you purchase the book, you'll have access to the one we're about to engage, but lucky for you, because you are part of the Liturgical Shenanigans community and the Wayfolk Arts community, you will have access to this individual one really quickly by the time this episode launches. But I hope that you will consider checking out this work, because all of the liturgical artists are really great people and have really cool stories to tell and to speak into.
What liturgy did you write?
Oh, yes. So I wrote several liturgies. One of them was a lament for women abused by clergy, because that is a big part of my story. So we also want to make sure, if for some reason, if you're kind of like me and sometimes you skip the intro to podcasts because you just want to get to the content, we want to make sure you know that this episode does come with a trigger warning because of the nature of this particular liturgy. So if you're someone who has survived clergy abuse, if you're someone who perhaps isn't in a place where they can engage with that particular kind of story for any variety of reasons, we want to make sure that you have good warning that is the topic of the liturgy itself, and it is okay if you need to sit this one out. I wrote in the little paragraph for the liturgy to be included within the book that the process of engaging hard parts of our story and dramatic parts of our story is really brave, and it is okay to engage it well in settings that are perhaps different than the ways you engage other things. So also, if you need to do this with a therapist or with a group of people that you really trust and love, if you need to do it by yourself in order to be safe and just get to be present to you, I'd really like to invite you, we'd all really like to invite you to do that. I also want to name, so the title of this is A Lament for Women Abused by Clergy. I identify with female pronouns, and so female pronouns are used throughout the liturgy itself. That does not mean that this isn't a story that can be part of any gendered person's story. So feel every freedom to replace your own preferred pronoun in the liturgy if that makes it more accessible for you. And please do not hear me saying or suggesting that this is a female only or a woman only identifying problem, because it absolutely isn't. I just happen to be a female who experienced it and chose to write a part of her story and engage it in this way to be part of healing. Yeah. Is there anything else we think I should say?
I think so. Thanks for bringing this liturgy today. It's going to be exciting to get to engage it. Exciting project that you got to be a part of. And I think with with the knowledge of what you've already said of preparing for this well, if this is an episode that you all out there are game to keep listening to, welcome to the rest of it. And I think we tend to just kind of invite folks to take a deep breath, ground yourself, maybe find a moment to sit down. And as we prepare to hear this liturgy, may our ears open to receive it well.
Reverend, preacher, pastor, prophet, man of God, Lord who molds us, are we still in your image even when we defile it? From the pulpit, he proclaimed that we are blessed, sinful, forgiven, worthy, called. In private, he proclaimed that we were lying, misreading, an attentive secret keeper, his best friend, a good girl. We feel marked as victims, skin burning where he touched us, dirty. Lord, do we still need you to make us clean if we didn't ask for the stains in the first place? Are sins done to us also ours? Do we repent the sins of someone else? Do we still need to die to rise again with Christ? Where were you when we were screaming? El Shema, God who hears Hagar, may we know you hear us too. Empower us to listen when you respond, proclaiming that we are clean, healed, good, survivors, and still in your image.
This feels like it deserves a long moment of silence afterwards.
I had a weird moment just now. That's the first time I've read that out loud. Where I was like, I didn't write the words amen in the liturgy. I wanted to say it because I think it's a natural inclination to say it. But then I went, ew, no. Not amen to that. Yeah.
What was the process like of kind of crafting this? So the project was pretty exciting, just to be a part of in general, and all that you said before about how like this is a project that is for people, for the people, written by the people for whom it is for. So the kind of process of writing liturgies for that project must have been an exciting one.
Yeah, I think the weirdest thing was turning this into we language, because it's a story that is so personal to me and also personal to a community of people. And what's the balance between me recognizing that I do have the right to speak words into something that I experienced, but I don't want to appropriate other people's experiences. And so how do you write something that is so deeply personal for the world at large to engage and be able to engage in their own context well?
Yeah.
So that was weird, and I still feel weird about it. And also feel like it's really important because I think we talked about last week, the reason Liturgical Shenanigans got its name is because it was a class.
Yeah, at least partially. Yeah.
And so in that class, we wrote liturgies and also shenanigans or rituals, things to engage in. And when I took that course, I wrote a ritual for some kind of like healing funeral-esque kind of service for someone who was abused by a clergy member. And I remember saying, it's so hard because I feel like the words for this don't exist. And so much of the responsibility to craft liturgy falls on the survivor.
Yeah.
And I think there is a responsible way to engage that. I do think that if you're crafting a service like that for someone, you want them to be involved and be empowered to speak specific words of their story into it. And it's nice to know words already exist, and this is one less thing I have to do in order to feel like I can engage a moment like this well. It's almost like it felt also like an act of hospitality, so that it didn't feel like words like this existed when it happened to me, and I wanted to maybe do some healing, but maybe this is a start of somebody's storytelling journey. With the caveat, please, just like I said with the gendered pronouns, like you always are empowered and allowed to change words to fit your tale. And even like reading this now, there are things in here. I wrote this, I don't know, 5 months ago, 6 months ago. What is time? I wrote this over the summer, and there are parts of it that I would change now just because of where I'm at. And I think that that's okay.
What are they?
Oh,
Can you share?
so the ending, El Shema, God who hears Hagar. So I find a lot of resonance with Hagar's story, and I think that is quite common for people who are aware of the biblical narrative, who have experienced abuse or abusive relationships, to find resonance with Hagar's story. I was reading it in a course recently. God doesn't really show up for Hagar in that story. God shows up for her son. It is Ishmael's cries that God speaks and responds to, not Hagar's. And God also sends Hagar back to her abuser. And we could have like a whole conversation about maybe why that was an act of caregiving at that point in time. And, God did still see Hagar. Hagar is, we get like one of God's first names from Hagar, El Roy, God who sees, right?
Yeah, who sees
Me.
Sees me,
Yeah,
God who
that's what I
sees
said,
me.
yeah. 'Cause the E on the end.
Which is lovely.
Just Roi as opposed to Roy.
Oh, I
Not-
see. I said it wrong.
No, well, I would just want to clarify that you said it correctly, but in case my dad listens, who is Leroy,
Oh, okay.
and that Roy is king, right?
Yep.
This isn't that one.
Not that one.
It's not that one, Elroy.
Elroy. Which is significant. That's a huge deal. A female victim gives us one of God's first known names. So there is some empowerment in that, but I have mixed feelings about being a fan of Hagar's story, and at the same time recognize that being sent back to your abuser is actually, unfortunately, really common, and sometimes feels like the safest option for a really long time. So,
I'm just interested now. You just said that it feels uncomfortable to be a fan of Hagar's story, and what I heard was you saying you're uncomfortable with what God does or doesn't do, but I'm curious how you react to this. But I think I hear you being a fan of Hagar's story, or of the Hagars.
yes,
You
of
know?
Hagar, yes. I think it's more like, did God actually hear Hagar?
Right.
Is that a proper
Response. Yeah.
and is that, and also like being thankful for God for specifically that thing, is that really right for me? Maybe it is for others, but I have a harder time with how God does or does not show up in Hagar's story than I did when I initially wrote this.
Which feels appropriate for Lament.
Yes.
Yeah.
And appropriate for the use of liturgy as storytelling as well, which you just said a couple minutes ago. Just like, I mean, stories, how you choose to tell your story at a different time will change. And so it makes a lot of sense to kind of come back to it even now 6 months later and see parts of the story that you would want to tell a different way perhaps. But liturgy as storytelling is such an interesting thing that we haven't really engaged on this podcast necessarily yet. We've kind of done a number of different liturgies so far, but it's a new way to think about both liturgy writing and engaging a liturgy.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, can we put some words to what we mean by liturgy as storytelling, as opposed to like telling a story, which a lot of our liturgies have done.
Yeah.
I think we're meaning something else here.
Yeah, I think what I mean is giving words to a specific event. Like Jackson's Darkening of Days had an aspect of you invited people to share stories. This feels like you could actually use this as your way of sharing a story. Maybe not for that specific ritual.
Sure, but yeah.
If we're sharing stories, these words could be used to share that specific story. I think too, I used to think liturgy just meant prayer and worship and nothing else. And it actually means a whole mess of things.
Yeah.
I don't know a church that would necessarily use this as part of their communion service or some kind of official thing. Maybe they would. That would be really cool. But you know what I mean? This is like a non-traditional
For sure.
way of putting words to a page and saying, engage God with this.
Yeah.
Or engage the divine with this. And it's not necessarily a poem.
Right, because it's right next, like a lot of what you're describing, like a poem describes a singular moment,
Right.
a piece of a story, but it is not quite a poem either. It's something else. It's, yeah.
It might be similar to like spoken word poetry, maybe.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. It's like half poem, half prayer, half liturgy, because liturgy is also about like the words of a collective rather than the words of an individual, says the one who specifically wrote a liturgy for herself. But I think like this particular piece lives in this really beautiful space that you also named as a complicated space earlier of you were writing this thing about your own story, but sort of on behalf of a group of people who share an experience, even if the details of the story are not the same. Perhaps the impact and the pain are shared, or can at least be understood in a different way by the other people who have experienced that particular thing. And like you named earlier, it's really powerful to have your own story, your own experiences reflected in the pieces that we engage in worship or in any sort of spiritual context. Because I feel like this isn't true in all spaces, but I think in a lot of spaces we end up disconnecting our stories and our intimate or like particular experiences from that space in worship, especially collective worship. And it like our own individual or particulars sort of fall aside so that we can participate in a larger story. But this sort of takes the particulars and draws them into all of that and connects you to so many other people in the writing and the speaking of them, not just the people who have had this done to them, but also the people who love people who have had this done to them. And like that circle, like kind of just keeps growing from there.
Yeah. Well, and I have two thoughts. My brain did two things in response to that. Oh no, the first thing my brain did went away.
It'll come back.
But one of the things my brain did was part of the reason why I think it is particularly powerful to have this included in a book for the collective is, and that is the point of, or one of the many points of this whole project. It gives voice to a silenced people, because women are often just silenced in the church generally.
Thanks, Paul.
But good old Paul. But also survivors are told to be quiet. They're accused of lying. They're accused of causing drama. They're accused of stirring the pot. If their stories are known, it's also told in hushed tones and rarely spoken of publicly, particularly not from the pulpit, particularly not from within the body that it actually occurred. It's, I think, a really tragic reality of our world, and by including this in a resource for the church or for any individual or group of people that are trying to engage biblical stories in a new way, that feels really, it was important to me that this kind of story be included in that. Yeah. I wish I knew what my brain did in response to the other thing, but maybe it will come back.
I have thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts. I love what you just said about including women who are often silenced, but unnamed. And this is a tricky thing for churches to figure out how to do. But, you got it? Do you want to go with it?
No, it's okay.
I won't forget what I'm going to say.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I just remembered it.
Yeah.
I once had a preacher professor tell me that when you are leading church, it is important to disengage as much as your own story from the pulpit so that your congregation doesn't feel responsible for caring for you. And I mean, that's all BS, but also like it is a shame because it makes worship even less of a personalized space for everybody, because one, you've shut off your personhood. So I've decided I'm not a person who, I don't carry stories anymore as a preacher. I'm just a voice with a microphone. Two, now have I really invited anyone else to share anything personal about their story in this worship space? But the thing that gets me is people might feel responsible for caring for you. One, that's on them. Unless a specific request was made, hey, I need you all to care for me today as I share this story. If you decided to care for me because I chose to share it, that's on you. Also, why is that bad? For people to respond in a caring way.
I'm game. I'll push on that one.
But that was in response to you talking about like how we've kind of depersonalized
Sure.
things from the collective.
Yeah.
It brings up a bunch of stuff that comes up in like therapist-y training on self-disclosure and why we do it. And I think this could tie to the preaching moment. I would say that the preacher has a different responsibility, similar, but different, and navigating self-disclosure is a much more important part of the pulpit important to do, not important to be careful about. To show here's how I struggle and here's what this looks like, because that's kind of what a shepherd do. But in therapy, it's a situation where it's really focused on the client, where the pastor is part of the congregation. And so if I'm going to disclose something in therapy, I need to be pretty sure that I'm doing it for the benefit of the client and not for my own work or therapy.
Right. You don't want to disclose something you've not at all done any work in processing.
And I would say the same thing's
Right.
true of a pastor, right? If I go up there and it's like, oh, I'm going through all this hard stuff and everybody take care of me, please, and I'm getting my needs met by sharing this with you, maybe there's a place for that.
Yeah, but it's different than like, I don't know, like trauma dumping on people
Right.
without, like, you can't, because I think absolutely 100% we do need to share our stories in the pulpit. And I also think there is like a line of appropriateness
Yes.
to be walked to about just like, I don't know, I often accidentally overshare. Like, it's like that, like,
It is a trauma response
Yeah.
to overshare.
Yeah.
right. But are you sharing the story for the benefit of the whole,
Right.
or for the benefit of the self?
What's
Right.
the purpose of it?
What
Right,
need is this meeting?
Right.
And is this the appropriate space for that,
Right.
given that? Yeah.
Well, and depending on your boundaries with your congregation too, right? Like, is this something that I'm only really going to want to disclose and process and engage with a friend? What's my comfort level in having a like coffee time conversation about whatever I just chose to say?
Right.
Yeah.
Are people might, if you actually share something vulnerable in the pulpit, people are going to want to come up and talk to you.
Right. And
about it
is that something
afterwards.
I'm okay with?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is my congregation equipped to hear
Yeah.
this?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or are you going to, in the rest of the sermon or in the liturgy,
Absolutely.
give tools for this kind of thing,
Absolutely.
equip them to do that? That's beautiful.
But I don't think that the answer is never share
Yeah.
anything or never display any emotion. That feels like something individuals need to process through if they feel like they want an emotionless.
And maybe this is a can of worms and we talk about this another time, but it also makes me interested about when we bring someone else forward. If you are a congregational pastor and you're in charge of a worship service and you let someone come speak, who's going to give a testimony or offer a prayer request or something like that, really, I would think the same screening applies, or the same responsibility to make sure that the congregation has the tools to deal with that or to care for that person yeah. Oh, that'd be a fun conversation.
Well, yeah, and then connected to that conversation is what you have, the sort of discipline that you've cultivated around caring for that too. Because because back to what you're saying, I love the comment around, like, if you never share something like this from the pulpit, you're not creating a space in which people can share some. So the cultivating of the culture around it is the kind of ongoing work. So that in the instance of some, maybe like I agree, you should always vet your guest speakers. But in the event that a guest speaker kind of goes off in a direction that you weren't prepared for, if you've cultivated a culture which is able to survive that moment.
Or be ready to say, like, how do we want to move forward from this for those that would like to have this conversation? Such and such is the way you can do that today.
Yeah.
It feels important. Mm-hmm. Not where I was going, but it feels important. I like it.
Yeah.
But I interrupted your other thought.
Yeah, so I'll go back to that. So you were talking about how this gives voice to people who are silenced, women who are silenced, people who are silenced, and that got me thinking about the nameless part, and how that can be tricky for churches to navigate because privacy and respect of folks who are survivors of these kinds of things, and so maybe because of that, or maybe just along with that, when churches do talk about this, and maybe even when they talk about it in ways we might call well, we're talking about the perpetrator. We're talking about the minister. That's so. If I talk about a scandal or something like that, we'll know his name. And I think I would agree with that's probably better than us all knowing her name or their names, and that means these are just unnamed people and their stories aren't heard or told.
You're getting one side
Yeah.
too. And I know from my own experience, I chose to still exist within the body I was a part of for a while. And like hearing the ways that the congregation members would talk about him or talk about like, I don't understand why we can't just forgive him and move on. Things happen because they didn't have the full story. They didn't have individuals.
It's just these nameless somebodies who made a
victim
claim.
number. I think I had a victim number in the whole thing. And yes, to like wanting to protect, and it's now still become my responsibility to decide if I want to share my story in order for them to understand the full picture of what actually happened. It just, it's all tricky. I have nothing but...
Well, and we've seen how many different cases of people being brave and sharing stories and
being annihilated.
being really
Or not
punished for it.
believed.
And so one of the things where my saga ends is one of the things I love about the way you've put this liturgy together is that it's the voice from that perspective. And when I hear these kinds of prayers, they might be about justice, and justice meaning something like retributive justice, maybe not necessarily, but directed toward perpetrator, directed toward the person who did the thing, being held responsible, being whatever. There's none of that here. Not that you don't have those thoughts, but that's not what this is about. It's for how shall we be healed? How do we even need to be forgiven? What does that even mean? And turning the spotlight on the people who often are just left out of the conversation when it really is about what they've experienced.
And I think it's, the person that wrote it, so maybe this is like way off, but I think it's generalized enough that it could also just be read as, here's the other side of this, without disclosing an individual's name, without disclosing an individual's story. If something like this happened and you wanted to make sure people had the full picture, ripple effect of why this named man or this named woman, whoever the perpetrator is, why what they've done is so much more than just their side or whatever thing they've released as their statement in response to being caught for doing the thing.
I would really like your hand and face moment, like everything you did with that to carry forward, because it was lovely.
Yeah.
We're nearing the end of our time for this podcast.
That went so fast.
It did, yes. But is there anything else kind of left that you'd want to be sure to comment on before we kind of settle in here at one more time?
I think I'll just name like gratitude for the invitation that this sort of liturgy invites us into, not only to hear the stories of particularly people abused by clergy, but also just the invitation to hear and share each other's stories, even when those things don't require a lament. Hopefully I'm making sense. I'm just grateful for the invitation to storytelling that this offers us today. So thank you, Maddie, for being willing to share this bit of yourself with us.
You're welcome. No, I'm just kidding. No, and thank you to anyone who kept listening and received it. I think too, I want to say, your stories deserve to be heard, no matter what they're about. And oftentimes, trigger warnings, I think, can or the ask for trigger warnings can sometimes get received as a form of silencing because your story is too much for people to hear. You're going to cause a disruption in somebody's system by sharing it. And it is absolutely true. We gave a trigger warning today for that reason, because we want people to decide what they need in order to gauge something. You are allowed to consent or not consent to receive something. That does not mean you don't get to share your story. It doesn't mean your story is bad. It doesn't mean that there are only certain places in the world where it's appropriate to share. It means that individuals all have things that they are capable and not capable of sitting with. And we as individuals are responsible for making those choices for ourselves. And we can do everything in our power to care well for one another by giving ample warnings before we share. That doesn't mean we don't share.
Yeah. And I just jump on and say, we earlier said if you pastors of churches are going to let things like this happen, maybe take care of your congregation well. And we don't know everybody. We don't know all of you who are listening. And I hope you have a network, someone you can speak with. If this brings up, I know for me, this liturgy brings up some rage, brings up some stuff that's mine to deal with that I don't need to put necessarily on the person telling me the story, you know? So I hope you have those spaces, a therapist, a great friend group. Maybe it's even your minister. But if you don't, that's a really good thing to find. And if you need help connecting with folks in your area, I would say, I'll say this time, and maybe if you're listening this way in the future, I'll have to rescind that. But you could probably throw that in the comments of wherever you found this. And if we can help connect you, like even send you some websites of stuff and information. But I know in Michigan, 211 is a great resource to find things. There's all kinds of ways that you can get connected to someone that can talk you through things that come up for you in this or other conversations.
Also, I just realized this is the so the first episode we did was also a liturgy I brought.
And Phil's giving mental health resources.
Well, sure. I mean, yes, that's not what I mean. Well, what I mean to say is both are like, this may be very uncomfortable for you to engage. So there's a theme here. Maddie's gonna make you uncomfortable, I guess.
Let's listen to it one more time. Would you be willing to read it again, Maddie?
Yes, and I hope you receive this in whatever way is going to be most meaningful and safest for you. Reverend, preacher, pastor, prophet, man of God, Lord who molds us, are we still in your image even when we defile it? From the pulpit he proclaimed that we are blessed, sinful, forgiven, worthy, called. In private he proclaimed that we were lying, misreading, an attentive secret keeper, his best friend, a good girl. We feel marked as victims, skin burning where he touched us, dirty. Lord, do we still need you to make us clean if we didn't ask for the stains in the first place? Are sins done to us also ours? Do we repent the sins of someone else? Do we still need to die to rise again with Christ? Where were you when we were screaming? El Shema, God who hears Hagar, may we know you hear us too. Empower us to listen when you respond, proclaiming that we are clean, healed, good, survivors, and still in your image.
Thanks again for joining us today for this episode of Liturgical Shenanigans. If you'd like to see more things this team creates, follow Wayfolk Arts on Instagram and Facebook, and check out our website at www.wayfolkarts.com. You can support this podcast and the other work Wayfolk Arts is doing by following the link in the description to our Patreon page. We are so grateful for your support. Thanks for being here with us today.